Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. You've been asking for it, here we go. The first of a wave of many 4K 240Hz QD-OLED monitor reviews, beginning with the Asus ROG Swift PG32UCDM. This monitor, and the others like it, have been some of the most highly anticipated displays in my time testing them, so let's talk in depth about what 4K OLED is bringing to the table for gamers. The PG32UCDM uses one of two 32-inch 4K OLED panels that are currently being manufactured. There's the 32-inch 4K 240Hz QD-OLED from Samsung Display, used in this monitor, and later in 2024 we'll be seeing a 32-inch 4K 240Hz WOLED from LG Display that also has dual mode functionality, allowing for a 480Hz refresh rate at 1080p. Asus are producing monitors using both panels. The one using the LG panel is the PG32UCDP, so just be aware of the similar naming there if you're watching this review once both are available. UCDM means QD-OLED, UCDP means WOLED. Along with the QD-OLED panel, the UCDM brings support for typical gaming features like adaptive sync, rated 0.03 millisecond response times, 99% DCI-P3 coverage, and of course, proper HDR functionality with display HDR 400 True Black certification and 1000 nits of peak brightness. Given this is a standard panel size, it has a high resolution and refresh rate, plus the per pixel local dimming functionality of OLED, this new wave of high-end monitors is set to offer an excellent range of capabilities for gamers that want the works. Asus's variant is priced at $1,300 US, which is $100 more than the price we have for two other variants from MSI and Alienware. You might have seen an even lower price for the MSI model, though they tell me that's a short-term introductory price and the MSRP remains at $1,200 US. It'll be interesting to see what Asus have done to justify a slightly higher price tag, though that analysis may have to wait until we test some of the other models. The PG32UCDM is very much an ROG Swift product in its design, utilizing several of the same sorts of elements we've seen from other monitors. The front is dominated by the large QD-OLED panel, of course, with relatively slim bezels on all four sides, as well as an ROG logo below the panel, which houses the directional OSD toggle on the back. This is a premium looking monitor with a nice usage of metal for the stand legs and plastic in other areas. On the rear, you'll find a typical OLED style design which has a central box housing all the components, then the display panel extends outwards from there with a nice thin aesthetic. The central box looks very similar to what we got on the 27-inch PG27AQDM from last year, just scaled up to accommodate the larger 32-inch QD-OLED panel. This is a passively cooled monitor using what Asus describes as a custom heatsink and graphene film to manage temperatures. Of course, it wouldn't be an Asus ROG product without some sort of lighting, so we get both an RGB LED matrix element on the rear and the Asus logo projection from the base of the stand pillar. I like that as time has gone on, Asus have toned down the game elements on their high-end monitors. The current design is still quite gamery, but doesn't go as hard down that path as some previous products. The stand is very sturdy and supports height, tilt and swivel adjustment. The stand legs occupy a pretty standard amount of desk space. This isn't a small monitor, but with the legs being elevated you can put stuff underneath to some degree. For ports, we have a decent selection here. One DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC, two HDMI 2.1 48GB/s ports with DSC, and a USB-C port that supports DP alt mode and up to 90 watts of power delivery. In addition, we get a few USB 3.2 Type A ports, a headphone jack, and optical audio out. Both DisplayPort and HDMI allow you to run the monitor at the maximum 240Hz refresh rate without compromises, and with the addition of a bunch of USB ports, a KVM switch is also included. The OSD is controllable through a directional toggle hidden behind the ROG logo on the front. It's a fast and easy to navigate interface that preserves your setting choices in the SDR and HDR mode separately. There's a pretty typical Asus range of features here, including their range of gaming specific functions like crosshairs, FPS counter, sniper mode, and shadow boosting, plus a decent range of color controls. There's even support for ELMB, black frame insertion, which I'll discuss later, something unique to their version of these OLED monitors. Obviously, a big talking point with the new 4K QD-OLEDs is text quality. Previously, gaming OLEDs have maxed out at 1440p with 27-inch type sizes. Alternatively, you've had to go to 42 inches to get 4K. With this PG32UCDM, we get a decent jump in pixel density with the move to a 32-inch 4K panel. We're now sitting at 140 ppi versus 110 ppi for those 1440p variants, a 27% improvement. And relative to first-gen QD-OLED panels, the improved subpixel structure introduced with second-gen QD-OLED also enhances the apparent pixel density for text and high contrast edges. I was genuinely quite impressed with the text clarity on this 4K QD-OLED monitor. The slight pink-green fringing you see on first-gen QD-OLED ultrawides, and to a lesser extent the second-gen variants, is a lot less noticeable at this 140 ppi pixel density. As someone that found the fringing issues with initial QD-OLEDs more noticeable than others, I'd say it's almost a non-issue here and not something you'll spot in everyday usage, even when using the panel beside a traditional LCD with an RGB striped subpixel layout. Using it alongside a 32-inch IPS LCD, I thought the text clarity and quality from this QD-OLED was very similar, perhaps not quite as good or identical to the IPS, but good enough to satisfy me, and I think I'm pretty sensitive to this stuff. The text clarity here is good enough that you should be able to use the UCDM at a wide variety of scaling factors in Windows. The default is 150%, but I typically use a 32-inch 4K panel at 125%, and that looks great. Even at 100% scaling, text is very readable and doesn't suffer from artifacts that are too annoying. The smaller you go, the harder it is to keep up with LCDs, but I'd still give a tick here for 100% scaling usability. All up, I'd say this 32-inch 4K QD-OLED panel is the first OLED panel I've used to provide text clarity that isn't a downgrade from an equivalent LCD. For panel composition and coding, this is your classic Samsung QD-OLED panel experience, which is to say it's glossy with an anti-reflective surface treatment. As I showed in my MSI monitor preview from earlier in the year, while Samsung are calling this a third-generation QD-OLED panel, the composition appears identical to second-gen QD-OLED, which is itself a small improvement over first-gen QD-OLED. What this means is the panel has the same issues described in previous QD-OLED reviews. In brighter environments where light sources are in front of the display, the panel has a tendency to reflect ambient light, raising blacks to the point where they appear somewhat grey. This impacts one of the key selling points to getting an OLED, which is its deep blacks. They just won't be that rich or deep in brighter conditions, especially relative to glossy WOLED panels. General reflection handling is decent, so mirror-like reflections aren't too bad, though being a glossy panel, there is always going to be some amount of visible, defined reflections which get worse the brighter the conditions are. However, the issues with the coding can be minimized by optimizing the placement of light sources in the room so that lights are behind the display. The darker the environment, such as gaming in a dim or fully dark room, the better this QD-OLED panel looks, and in dim conditions you will typically get a rich, deep OLED black experience. It's really hard to say whether this will be an issue for you, as it can be a case-by-case basis. Personally, I do find it annoying and one of the larger issues with QD-OLED panels, but if you primarily game at night, it's not anywhere near as much of a concern. At the very least, it's something to be aware of. What's also important to be aware of is that OLEDs generally aren't great monitors for desktop usage, productivity apps, and web browsing because they are susceptible to permanent burn-in, and this new 4K QD-OLED is no exception. Anything with static content like toolbars or icons on screen for a long period of time, like you get with most desktop applications, is at risk of burning in. Conversely, dynamic content like gaming or watching videos is at practically no risk of burn-in, so don't worry about this if you're primarily using an OLED for gaming. Even the occasional bit of desktop app usage is fine. It's more 8 hours a day of productivity work that may lead to burn-in, and this is something we'll be exploring on the channel soon. As for burn-in warranty, Asus have recently updated the warranty for their OLEDs to offer at least 2 years of burn-in coverage. In the case of the PG32UCDM, we're getting 3 years of coverage as specified on their website, which is a good amount that matches the competition, such as the Alienware monitor and more recently MSI's variant. This gives you some peace of mind that you should be able to use the display normally and not have to worry about burn-in, and if you do experience burn-in, you'll be able to file a warranty claim. With that said, we'd still recommend trying to minimize burn-in during usage, like minimizing the taskbar, setting the display to turn off after a short period of inactivity, and reducing static app usage. This should help extend the life of your monitor beyond the 3-year warranty period. I mean, it costs over $1,000 US, so you'd be hoping to get at least 5 years out of it, if not more. In terms of response time performance, it's no surprise to see this QD-OLED panel offering lightning fast speeds, similar to other QD-OLEDs we've tested. At its maximum 240Hz refresh rate, we're seeing a 0.3 millisecond average response, which is extremely fast, and that leads to excellent motion clarity. With no noticeable inverse ghosting, this Asus model is on par with other OLEDs for speed and superior to any LCD at the same refresh rate. You'll also notice better motion clarity at the highest refresh rate than first generation QD-OLEDs due to the increase from 175Hz to 240Hz. The best part of how OLEDs function is that performance is basically identical at all refresh rates. This means whether we're testing at 240Hz, 120Hz, or 60Hz, we're still seeing about a 0.3 millisecond response time average. LCDs typically get slower as the refresh rate decreases, but that isn't the case here. So the UCDM offers a single overdrive mode experience, without any overdrive settings of course, as they aren't required for an OLED. There is effectively no difference in response time performance between this QD-OLED and other OLED monitors. As the UCDM has a high 240Hz refresh rate, you can ensure when buying this display that its motion clarity is excellent. Where the big difference lies is between OLED and LCD. This Asus monitor is much faster than the fastest LCD I've tested, which is a big win for OLED, and it only gets better when looking at average performance. While LCDs do get a bit slower at lower refresh rates, OLEDs don't, so the gap between OLED and LCD grows. If you want a highly consistent gaming experience from your monitor, there's no better choice than an OLED. It's also good to confirm excellent cumulative deviation results, though no different from most other OLEDs. As expected, this really is the same technology that delivers the same response time performance as other QD-OLEDs, such as the ultrawides we've tested previously. The PG32UCDM does support black frame insertion through Asus's ELMB feature, the same functionality introduced on their WOLED-based PG34UCDM that I reviewed a few weeks ago. This is the OLED equivalent to backlight strobing, where the monitor flicks to black between frames to reduce sample and hold motion blur and increase clarity. OLEDs have no backlight, hence black frame insertion rather than backlight strobing. ELMB on this OLED is very restrictive as it only works at a fixed 120Hz. No other refresh rates are supported and there's no tuning ability. This is because at 120Hz with ELMB, the monitor is effectively running at 240Hz, just showing every second frame as black. The need for tuning is less on an OLED as there's no difference in clarity between the top and bottom of the screen as the strobe is perfectly synced across the display, but you can't tune the strobe length, which typically would adjust clarity and brightness. At 120Hz, using ELMB does look clearer than not using ELMB, but the implementation is far from perfect. As this is simply showing a black frame every second frame, the non-black image frames have a long strobe length, the length of each refresh cycle, which does lead to some blur relative to a well-strobed LCD that typically would produce a much shorter, sharper pulse. A short image pulse with a long black cycle produces the best image clarity, but this OLED really isn't capable of doing this. All it's doing is running its normal refresh cycle and switching between an image frame and black frame. The end result is that the ELMB mode at 120Hz looks similar, maybe a little clearer than 120Hz without BFI, while being much more restrictive. You have to sacrifice VRR and HDR, the brightness output is lower, and it requires running games at a fixed 120 FPS. It's a nice bonus feature, but I personally wouldn't use it, and it's not able to deliver the crystal clear output of the best backlight strobed LCDs like the Asus PG32UCDM. Input latency is excellent, offering a sub 0.5 millisecond processing delay in both the SDR and HDR modes. Combined with fast response times and a high refresh rate, this OLED feels very snappy to use and is well suited to competitive multiplayer titles, although the resolution may prevent high levels of performance without upscaling. This is as fast as you'll get on a 4K monitor right now, although for extreme gamers there's also the dual mode 480Hz displays coming later in the year. We're about to test some 360Hz QD-OLEDs, and there's also 540Hz LCDs on the market at a 1080p resolution, plenty of choices for those that are latency sensitive. Power consumption is on the high side when displaying a full white image, although this is to be expected from OLED monitors where full white is a worst case scenario. This 32-inch 4K panel has a 9% larger screen area than 34-inch QD-OLEDs from before, yet power consumption is 27% higher than the AW3423DWF, one of the more efficient QD-OLEDs I've tested. Full white power consumption is about 3 times what you'd see from a modern efficient 4K IPS LCD of the same size, such as the LG 32GR93U, obviously not ideal for productivity work where you'll largely be seeing some big white areas. With that said, OLED power consumption is heavily dependent on the average picture level, or APL, of the content being displayed. Content with less white and therefore a lower APL noticeably reduces power consumption. For example, the homepage of Google in a full screen Chrome tab is about 95 watts, the YouTube homepage about 68 watts, a default Windows 11 desktop with the standard blue default wallpaper about 51 watts, and the Steam interface showing the store homepage about 32 watts. Showing a pure black image consumes 28 watts, about 3 watts of that is attributable to the RGB LED lighting enabled by default. Only in the best cases will this OLED match the power consumption of the 32GR93U, but typical numbers aren't outrageous in comparison to some other LCDs I've tested, like the Odyssey Neo G7 that uses 62 watts at 200 nits. The color space on offer from these new 4K QD-OLED panels is very similar to previous QD-OLEDs. We're getting 99.1% coverage of DCI-P3 and 97.7% coverage of Adobe RGB, both strong results for work in those color spaces or for viewing HDR content. In total, I saw 79.3% coverage of Rec 2020, which again is very similar to previous QD-OLEDs. This panel technology has a notably higher color gamut than WOLED, and there's an even higher discrepancy in HDR color volume, which also factors in brightness at various color outputs. QD-OLEDs can typically get much brighter than WOLED when displaying highly saturated colors. Default color calibration is pretty good from this monitor, although it's unclear exactly what mode it will ship in by default. When I received my unit, it was configured to use the sRGB Cal mode, however a factory reset put it in the racing mode. As such, I'm showing the racing mode results here. Grayscale performance is pretty good in this mode, especially for white balance, which is close to accurate and maintained across the range. This leads to good Delta E performance and no obvious color tint. Some OLEDs I've tested have been blue tinted by default, but that isn't the case here. However, in this configuration there is no sRGB clamp enabled by default for SDR content, so we do get oversaturation and higher Delta E averages. Compared to other monitors, the grayscale results are good in the upper tier of similar products. Color checker results are average though, and impacted by the display's especially wide color gamut. Luckily, it's very easy to improve factory performance on this monitor, and there are multiple ways to achieve strong sRGB performance. The most flexible way is simply to change the display's color space from wide gamut to sRGB. This effectively enables an sRGB mode while keeping other settings unlocked for adjustability. The other way is using the built-in sRGB Cal mode, a more locked down sRGB mode. I found the first method simply changing the color space to be more accurate. This sRGB mode is excellent with very strong factory grayscale results. A Delta E ITP average of 3.25 is fantastic among gaming monitors, and it's complemented by a great color temperature. Performance is even better looking at saturation and color checker results, where the Delta E ITP average is below 3 in both cases. Outstanding performance for those wanting better SDR accuracy with a single setting change. Compared to other monitors, sRGB mode grayscale performance is right up there with the top handful of monitors on the market. In color checker, the PG32UCDM is able to top the charts, which is a perfect result from this high-end monitor and shows how well calibrated it is. Performance in the SDR mode can be improved slightly for sRGB after a full CalMan calibration. I was pretty happy with these results given the dynamic nature of OLEDs can affect results compared to an LCD. Even for wide gamut P3 work, this display is capable of a very accurate experience after calibration. Maximum brightness in the SDR mode is very similar to other QD-OLED monitors at 245 nits, within 10% of the best OLED results I've seen, though naturally still a bit low relative to LCD monitors. Asus shipped this display with a uniform brightness setting that you can enable, which disables the automatic brightness limiter and caps the brightness to 245 nits, or lower depending on your brightness setting, regardless of window size or APL. With the setting disabled, brightness will vary and could get higher in the SDR mode, though I find this annoying for desktop usage. Also worth pointing out is that peak SDR brightness in real-world content is affected by the auto logo brightness feature in the OSD's screen protection section. With this feature disabled, you can consistently get up to 245 nits in apps. If it's enabled, most real-world app brightness is capped at around 220 nits, so a little lower than the full screen capabilities. You'd only then see 245 nits in some scenarios like full screen white or other optimal dynamic conditions. This applies to all brightness settings, so for example, if you calibrate to 150 nits in a full white window, real app brightness is going to be more like 125 nits with auto logo brightness enabled. It seems this setting loves to trigger and dim brightness slightly when there is any hint of static content on screen in certain conditions. Minimum brightness is very low at just 14 nits, great if you need a dim viewing experience when trying to read web pages at night. I was very impressed with the viewing angles of this panel. They are very wide, which makes it easy to view the display even at quite extreme angles. It really looks excellent. This also means that there is a large sweet spot for viewing this QD-OLED, and you won't notice issues like the edges being slightly lower contrast or a bit washed out, which can be an issue with some flat LCD panels, particularly V8s. Uniformity was also very good with my unit, nice and uniform viewing full white, and no dirty screen effect viewing dark greys. The Asus PG32UCDM is an excellent HDR display. This is due to OLED technology's inherent hardware qualities that are tailor-made for displaying HDR content. The key feature here is that each individual pixel is self-lit, meaning at a pixel level, the display can turn on or off to accurately display everything from dark shadows to bright highlights. When the display needs to show pure black, it can fully switch off, giving us the trademark rich zero-level blacks and deep shadows that OLED is known for. This is in contrast to most HDR-capable LCD panels, which are not fully controllable at the pixel level. LCDs require a backlight, and for HDR displays this typically means the use of full array local dimming, a technology that splits the backlight into zones. Whereas OLED can turn off each pixel individually, LCDs with local dimming can only turn off certain zones encompassing hundreds or even thousands of pixels. This can still be effective for HDR content and look great, but it has some fundamental flaws in difficult circumstances. For example, when showing a bright and dark element close together, an OLED can control each pixel as needed with a clean, accurate distinction between bright and dark. LCDs with local dimming need to masterfully control the zones to achieve the necessary distinction between bright and dark, and when the element is too small or not in the optimal position, the bright element can spill into the dark area within the backlight zone, creating ugly blooming artifacts. OLED therefore has the edge when it comes to displaying clean HDR content with minimal blooming or haloing. In some scenes this will be the difference between raised blacks and deep blacks, such as for star fields and Christmas lights. At other times, OLED can have a brightness advantage for small bright objects within a dark scene. Subtitles will look cleaner on an OLED with reduced blooming, and generally OLEDs produce richer shadows thanks to its inherently higher contrast ratio. Aside from brightness and shadow detail, OLEDs also have other advantages for HDR. As there are no backlight zones, OLEDs are faster to transition between bright and dark with no visible zone transitions. OLEDs are much less likely to suffer from backlight flickering, although light PWM behavior, especially when using a variable refresh rate, is common. And OLEDs like this one do not increase input latency in its HDR mode, as they don't need to run a backlight zone algorithm. The PG32UCDM comes well configured for HDR out of the box and has graceful, painless switching between the HDR and SDR modes that requires no user OSD interaction after you set up each mode to your liking. Asus offers several HDR modes, though I found the default console HDR setting to offer the best, most accurate experience. In this mode, EOTF tracking is excellent at a 10% window size, perfectly following the curve with good roll-off near the maximum and strong dark performance, so this monitor is neither too dark nor too bright in this crucial area that impacts shadow detail. An HDR grayscale delta E average of 3.41 is very good and also indicates little to no color temperature issues. Whites are not tinted even when bright, which is a good sign to see. I was also impressed with HDR color accuracy. When looking at saturation sweeps and other tests, this display is well tuned and delivers a nice, accurate experience while gaming. This is further complemented by its wide Rec 2020 color gamut, so typically this display looks fantastic, showing HDR content that makes use of brightness, shadow detail, and color saturation. Very few complaints here. Like other QD-OLEDs, EOTF tracking isn't as strong outside of 10%, so for example, when we test 2%, which shows the monitor is capable of 1000 nits of peak brightness, roll-off isn't as nice near that 1000 nit mark. You'll see similar at a 25% window size, but still the performance is good and this doesn't have a huge impact on the experience. What I thought was very strange though is the experience testing on Nvidia and AMD GPUs. Previously we've seen some monitors where we can achieve the expected brightness on an Nvidia GPU but not an AMD GPU. The Samsung Odyssey OLED G9 comes to mind. On this Asus monitor, in both our test patterns and video content, you get the same performance and experience regardless of what GPU brand you have. However, while gaming, I found that in some games, not all, but some, like Cyberpunk 2077, the UCDM only delivered about half the real-world brightness on an AMD GPU versus an NVIDIA GPU testing in the exact same area. So for example, if the NVIDIA GPU did 1000 nits, the AMD GPU would only do 500 nits. This was only true in these games, and not true while, for example, watching an HDR movie where both the NVIDIA and AMD GPU would do 1000 nits. Asus believes this is caused by AMD using GPU-side HDR tone mapping in some situations with their FreeSync Premium Pro HDR pipeline, a possible explanation we've mentioned in other reviews. NVIDIA always sends the signal to the display for display-side tone mapping, but AMD doesn't do that. It's odd to see that with this specific monitor, this only affects some content, not all content like on the Samsung OLED G9. It's also not clear whether this is Asus's fault because they haven't properly implemented FreeSync Premium Pro, or whether it's AMD's fault for botching FreeSync Premium Pro with this monitor on the GPU driver side. Either way, it's a problem that Asus and AMD will need to sort out for regular buyers. For those that want to tinker, there is a workaround where you can force FreeSync Premium Pro to revert to FreeSync Premium without GPU-side tone mapping by editing the EDID in CRU. This fix allowed the PG32UCDM to deliver the same in-game brightness and performance on an AMD GPU as on an NVIDIA GPU. Hopefully there will be a better solution in the future that is enabled through a firmware or driver update. For now, let's look at best case brightness, the default experience on an NVIDIA GPU. Again, no real differences compared to previous QD-OLED monitors. The PG32UCDM does about 260 nits full screen white, 475 nits at a 10% window size, and 1042 nits at a 2% window size. This gives the display strong brightness for small bright elements, but fairly weak brightness around 10% as seen in the brightness versus window size chart. Large screen brightness is decent for an OLED, but not a standout. Real-world brightness in scene 1 was surprisingly low at just 230 nits, and while it's a mid-APL type of scene, I was a bit surprised and puzzled by this result. However, in our low APL scene 2, the PG32UCDM is much more in line with expectations, pushing 898 nits, which is very strong. While gaming, I saw just shy of 1000 nits peak, and in several other tests saw normal real scene brightness in line with other QD-OLEDs, so it seems that scene 1, this result is just an outlier. Final section of this review is the new Hub Essentials Checklist 2.0. In this first part, we're assessing how accurate Asus's spec sheet is and also providing some additional information ourselves. In general, Asus do a great job of advertising their monitor outside of unrealistic response time numbers. I appreciate how Asus specifically say the 250 nit number is for 100% APL, while also providing peak HDR results of 1000 nits, making it very clear to consumers what they can expect in terms of brightness. The second section is a look at key features and whether Asus supports them with this monitor. It's no surprise to see an OLED performing well in the motion and contrast areas with lots of green ticks. I also gave a few borderline results for things such as factory calibration, as I wasn't sure exactly what mode is enabled by default. Rec 2020 coverage fell just short of 80%, and of course the weird AMD HDR performance issue. Some other important areas to mention are that Asus are planning to add in Dolby Vision support in a future firmware update. However, the shipping firmware does not support this feature as of yet. I do believe this 4K QD-OLED panel has RGB stripe level text clarity, and it was also nice to see features like passive cooling and no flickering in our stress tests. DSC can also be disabled, though you can't use the monitor at 240Hz without DSC, even over HDMI 2.1. Phaser mounting is provided through an included bracket. Overall, the Asus ROG Swift OLED PG32UCDM is pretty much exactly what many high-end gamers have been craving, a QD-OLED experience scaled up to a 32-inch 4K panel format. The end result is an excellent gaming experience. It's large, it's high resolution, it's fast, it has proper HDR support. I think 4K OLED monitors like this will be the obvious choice for most people with more than $1,000 US to spend on a desktop gaming display. The performance characteristics of the PG32UCDM aren't especially surprising. This is the QD-OLED tech we've come to love over the last 18 months, resized to a new format. So we're getting the same elite response time speeds, the same brightness characteristics, including 1000 nits peak brightness, the same sort of HDR performance, and similar flaws to other QD-OLEDs as well. Really, this is what we want to see because we already know QD-OLEDs are great for gaming. Combining a 240Hz refresh rate with super fast response times leads to elite motion clarity that we've never seen before at this resolution. 4K gaming has really never looked this good or this clear, and even though the GPU requirements to drive such a high resolution and refresh rate are massive, this OLED is still brilliant at lower refresh rates and provides a ton of headroom for future PC hardware upgrades. There's benefits for all types of gamer here because competitive or faster paced games look great at 4K 240Hz, while single player titles also benefit from the combination of a high resolution and true HDR. Deep blacks, per pixel local dimming, bright highlights, and excellent tuning from Asus deliver stunning visuals across the board, and it's probably the best suited of the OLED formats yet for console gamers given its 4K resolution, HDR, and HDMI 2.1 support. The increased pixel density from this panel has huge benefits for text clarity and productivity work as well, although there are still risks using an OLED for static desktop apps, something we'll be exploring soon. Asus are now finally offering a burn-in warranty for their OLEDs, 3 years for the UCDM, which at least gives you some peace of mind. This is the best suited OLED monitor yet for desktop work, but until I get a good grasp on how burn-in fares, I'm still not comfortable recommending it for that specific use case. I was impressed with Asus's color tuning in both the SDR and HDR modes. It's fantastic compared to most other gaming monitors I've tested. The port selection is excellent with most of the stuff you'd want. Firmware updates are supported. Dolby Vision is apparently coming later. There's even eLMB at 120Hz if you want to use it, something unique to this product. So what are the drawbacks here? What are the reasons not to immediately drop $1,300 US on this thing? Honestly, there aren't a ton of issues here, the biggest being the QD-OLED panel coding issues we've discussed before, as well as a few issues with AMD GPU HDR performance. For mixed workloads or heavy productivity, I'd also hesitate just due to that burn-in risk. I've also seen this monitor or this type of 4K QD-OLED panel described as an endgame product or an ultimate display you'll never need to upgrade from. While it is an excellent product, no doubt, I tend to disagree with that assessment. I expect OLEDs to get brighter, more resilient against burn-in, higher refresh rate, better panel coatings, and cheaper as time goes on, as well as more accessible through other panel formats. To me, this almost feels like we're just getting started in terms of true high-end OLED monitors for gaming. We've gotten through the early adopter phase with the ultra-wides and so on. Now is where the real business begins and the doors open up to everyone else. The big question here is whether you should purchase the Asus PG32UCDM at a $100 premium over some of its competitors or wait for a different variant. Given that a lot of the other products using this panel are about to hit the market at the same time, I think it's at least worth waiting to see how the competition fares. I've already got 2 others using this panel that I'll be testing shortly. As we saw from the ultra-wides, there can be surprising performance differences between units that are worth knowing about. Beyond that, it could be also worth waiting to see how the WOLED equivalents go, especially as they are offering an interesting 1080p 480Hz mode, though we're not expecting them until later in the year, so it depends how long you want to wait. Either way, exciting times for those after a new high-end gaming monitor in 2024, and I've been very impressed with these 4K QD-OLED monitors. Anyway, that's it for this one, a long-awaited review of some of those 4K QD-OLEDs, starting with the Asus model, of course, that we covered in this review. You will see reviews shortly for the MSI and Alienware variants, and we'll try and get in a whole range of different QD-OLEDs throughout 2024. I've got a 360Hz model as well to test out. I think another one's coming soon, plenty of monitors to test, so if you want all those reviews, all that content, the best way to keep in touch with that is to subscribe to Monitors Unboxed. Give the video a like, and also if you do want to support our independent monitor testing and allow us to buy some of the monitors that perhaps we're not getting sent, I'm not sure exactly what's happening there, but if you do want to support the channel, allow us to buy some of those monitors, the best way to do that is via Patreon or Float Plan. Links are in the description below, and doing so, you'll gain access to some pretty cool benefits like our Discord community, great place to chat about monitors, monthly live streams, we've got our BTS videos, stuff like that. So yeah, long review this one. Thanks for watching to the end, and I'll catch you in the next one.